When you look across the vast, ever-expanding GLP-1 landscape, you see a handful of key players with different services offered. At the top, you have the two leading manufacturers, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly. Then there are some other drug makers who are trying to get their respective GLP-1s to market, including Roche, Amgen, Zealand Pharma, and several others. You also have a coterie of telehealth firms like Ro, Hims & Hers, and Weight Watchers, which have fully embraced the rise of the DTC healthcare models. Finally, you have Noom, which attempts to differentiate itself from other telehealth shops by billing itself as a behavior change company. Simply put, Noom takes a lifestyle-based approach to weight loss, delving into the habits of its users and reorienting them towards healthier routines for diet and exercise. Building off that foundation, Noom then got into the GLP-1 prescription business in 2023. Armed with a subscription-based health app and a substantial ad spend for campaigns featuring celebrity spokesperson Rebel Wilson, Noom has raised nearly $660 million over 10 funding rounds since its founding in 2008. Yet like Weight Watchers, the company's pivot in the age of GLP-1s hasn't been without bumps along the way. Noom conducted mass layoffs in 2022 and 2025 amid a slowdown in its key business units. Still, the company is trudging forward. Over the last year, Noom took out a full-page print ad in the Wall Street Journal calling on policymakers to create new guidance around expensive drugs, launched its microdose GLP-1 program, and on top of it all, acquired Tailor-Made Compounding, a licensed 503A pharmacy. This week, Noom CEO Jeff Cook returns to the show to chat with reporter Bella Jakowski about the company's plans for the future, how the GLP-1 treatment space needs to evolve, and what their go-forward advertising strategy is. For our trend segment, we're talking about a pair of recent Supreme Court rulings, including the skinny label case between Hikma and Amarin, as well as Bayer's Roundup decision, and what they mean for the healthcare industry. But before we hop into our feature interview, you're going to get to hear from our editorial director, Jameson Fleming. Jameson's back from his week-long trip covering Cannes, and he's got a full rundown of what you need to know about how medical marketing's top work was received over there. Jameson, it is great to have you back stateside. Let's start with the obvious. How was covering Cannes?
It was a great trip. Hot, which I think everybody has said, and I probably didn't really need to say, but it was hot. But no, it was a great week. I saw a lot of people there that I knew, met a lot of new folks. It was a weird conference from the standpoint that it feels like an ad tech conference these days and not a conference or a festival of creativity, but had a really great time there. And I think a lot of people who went really enjoyed themselves this year.
I saw you talking about that on our various social media, and obviously, you sent us an audio hit last week for the episode, which we'll talk about. But talk a little bit about the ad tech side of things in terms of just what you're noticing, that greater shift in the industry, because obviously you have a wider berth than we do in terms of what we cover here. So what was that, and maybe some of the other trends that you were noticing on the ground?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're in an industry where everybody, platform side, media side, is absolutely hounding marketers for their dollars. And they're trying to get any ounce of their media budgets to go in their direction. And so when you gather a bunch of executives in the south of France, well, ad tech companies and the platforms are going to show up and try to woo them. They're going to wine and dine them. They're going to bring every celebrity and creator on the planet to impress them. And so when you look at what Cannes has become, is you've got the Palais, which still firmly feels like a place for creativity. And then as soon as you walk outside the gates, actually, you don't even have to walk outside the gates, because within the spots that's owned by Cannes Lion, you have Trade Desk and you have Tubi and you've got MediaLink and UTA. I mean, you've got everybody showing up in spaces that's owned by Cannes. But then you walk down the beach and you see all the platforms. You go into the cafes and you see more platforms and media companies. Even TiVo still has its balcony, which I chuckle at. Every single year, they have the same freaking balcony with the same banner. Never changes, but it's a firm reminder that TiVo is still in business, doing God knows what.
I was about to say that's next year's plan, is you have to go and figure out what TiVo actually does as a business in the year of 2026. But it's interesting to hear you talk about that. And it kind of makes sense. Like, it's always the old adage of follow the money. And obviously the money is on the more ad tech side of things. So it makes sense that that's where it would sway. I wanted to talk about something you brought up in the podcast last week that I thought was interesting. You said that the quality seemed to be on the up and up. And I know Madden heard the same thing from a lot of the jurors that he spoke with too. Chris Charles, who we had on here, who was part of the pharma jury from 21 grams, said the same thing. But the quantity was down. And you had even talked about that, like walking the Palais, you didn't see nearly the same amount of work as you did last year. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic? Because it's kind of an interesting push and pull there.
Yeah, it was interesting because the jury president and even the health and wellness jury president was very firm in that, they believe it's a category on the verge of a breakout, that the work was improving, that they were just really impressed with the ideas and across the board. And it's, not just the US, there's a lot of winners and a lot of short lists of stuff from across the world where, branded DTC advertising can't happen. But then you go to actually see what they awarded, and they only awarded 7 pieces of work in the entire pharma category out of about 250 entries. And based off of, what Cannes says for expectations of just what percentage win, bronze, silver, gold, and Grand Prix, we probably should have seen more like 10 or 12 pieces of work winning something in the pharma category, but there was only 7. And yeah, it's hard to say if the depth of work was there because they displayed virtually none of it. I was really excited to go down there and see, what was going to win this year, what was at least shortlisted and what they felt was like worth highlighting. And then, there's a handful of pieces of work to look at instead of, 20, 30 pieces of work. And I think the other thing I noticed was last year, I found a lot of things from health and wellness, especially, and to a lesser extent, pharma, scattered among all the other categories. So you would just be walking through creative use of data or, media plan or, any kind of different category. And you would often see some of the same campaigns popping up, winning Lions across other categories as well. I saw very little of that. I just did not see things from this sector showing up on the billboards for the other categories. So it was kind of a disappointment to see so little pharma and health and wellness work showing up in the Palais basement for people to learn from.
And obviously you don't work for Cannes Lions, but I think a lot of people would hear that, and naturally as a B2B publication, we have to explore it. That's the problem. That's the obstacle. How do you overcome that? Like, is it just having more daring, crafty, creative work? Is it going outside of, the similar concepts? Like, how do you actually make a difference and get to that higher number you talk about?
And I think part of it is pharma needs to be willing to enter more work. I mean, there are campaigns that you and I have seen, and we're going to see in the MM+M awards coming up that didn't win in Cannes or didn't even maybe get entered. And I think these companies need to be willing to put up more work from their respective companies. And then aside from that, continue to learn from the consumer side. I did that story last year about Novartis sending 20 plus people every year to Cannes to learn. And then they come back and they hold a East Canover Day because they're in East Hanover, New Jersey. And they teach the entire marketing organization about what they learn. And then they won the Grand Prix in the pharma category. I think these companies need to invest in creativity, send some people over there and really take it in. I mean, I think that was one of the things that surprised me was I had trouble finding pharma people in Cannes this year. Last year, they were everywhere. And this year, I felt like they were far between in Cannes.
Yeah, which is obviously a frustration there where it's like if you're not putting in the investment, then you're not going to be able to reap the rewards like you talk about, whether it's Novartis. Another one that comes to mind was Opella, too. I remember we did a story on them last year that they really made a concerted effort and they came away with some Lions last year. So hopefully they're able to take that to heart and make a plan out of that. I did want to ask you, obviously you had plenty of coverage there that we're going to be able to see in the coming days and weeks. Obviously, that's the most important stuff. But then there's the other fun stuff, the going to actually see the work that you talk about, the networking, the dinners, the rosé. I want to ask a more particular question. If there was a celebrity or public figure that you saw or interacted with that stuck out to you in Cannes this year.
Yeah. I mean, when I think to what Cannes is and I try to describe it like to my neighbors here in New Jersey who are like, what on earth do you do? I think the perfect way, the epitome of what Cannes is I went to a dinner Tuesday night on Stagwell Sport Beach with 72 and sunny. I was 2 seats over from Brandon Marshall, the NFL wide receiver from the 2010s and 2000s, who's a legend. I was a few seats down from Hillary Knight, the hockey player, captain of the U.S. women's hockey team. Doc Rivers is there. I mean, there's about 30 or 40 different athletes. So I'm a couple seats over from Brandon Marshall. Flavor Flav is reuniting Public Enemy on stage, and I'm getting a private concert from Public Enemy for 20 minutes. And then you turn off to the right and you see a drone show from Cargo, which is, I believe, an ad tech company, over the port. And then behind that, there's a cruise ship lit up, spelled with Canva across it. I mean, it's basically Mad Libs. You can just insert whatever celebrity and artist and whatever you want to come up with, and that's Cannes. It's just insanity.
Having not heard that story before we started recording this, I was also trying to figure out where it was going and how it was going to end. So that's quite the event. Is there anything else Cannes related? And obviously, again, people are going to be able to see the coverage on the website, and we have more in the podcast coming up. But anything else that's just the immediate takeaways? I know you've only been home for a couple of days now, but just as you're kind of digesting, what comes to mind?
Yeah. Look, I mean, since I joined MM+M, I've had a very firm kind of vision of I want this industry to realize that creativity drives business results, and to look at their consumer counterparts and realize the things you can do in this business, especially from a storytelling standpoint. Pharma sits on probably the best stories of any category. Point blank. The amount of amazing things you can and relay about the impact of your medicines, it far outweighs any other category. And I want this industry to think about Cannes and think what you can learn from Cannes. Go to Cannes and just see the best storytelling in the world and apply it to this category, because you will save lives. It's as simple as that. You will improve lives and you will save lives. But, the first step is realizing what's possible.
Yeah, and where there is that room for improvement you talk about there. So hopefully our listeners take that to heart and they're able to put that into some of their work, and it gets awarded next year. But obviously, like you said, we're going to the judging for the MM+M Awards, and we hope to see some of that on display too, and be really able to hand out awards that recognize that. So I appreciate you hopping on here and being able to go through everything. And I know that obviously you have the added responsibility now of doing all the stuff with the campaign, but we appreciate being able to hear your insights for what the medical marketers can take away from it. It's always valuable.
Always happy to be on the podcast.
Awesome. Thank you, Jameson.
Excited to have Jeff Cook with us here today, the CEO of Noom, to talk a little bit about the very crowded weight loss space and sort of where Noom sees itself fitting in and standing out in some ways. So I think it'd be an understatement maybe to say that the weight loss category has been transformed by GLP-1s and the widespread uptake, but it's also become, incredibly crowded from a marketing standpoint. How does Noom differentiate itself in that space?
I think the main way we differentiate ourselves is Noom's first and foremost a behavior change company. So Noom got started as a behavior change company, remains a behavior change company today. And our focus is really taking this whole person approach to health, especially with respect to nutrition, movement, mindset. And we bring that comprehensive program into our GLP-1 therapy. And so people who are starting with Noom are generally looking to make the lifestyle change alongside the weight loss. And so that's fundamentally the difference. If you look at, our own, I looked at some Sensor Tower data recently comparing Noom, Hims, Row, our retention rate at day 30 is 3 to 5 times, those other programs, in part because we have a significant behavior change program that we've been investing in for many years. So I would say that's the fundamental difference, is this aspect of combining the behavior change with the medication. We've been doing that now for more than 3 years with our GLP-1 companion product.
Absolutely. And I think, seeing as our audience is predominantly medical marketers and advertisers, I'd love to hear how you landed on Rebel Wilson as a spokesperson, as a brand partner. It seems like the reaction to that has been really, really positive. And my editor and I were talking before this call, and she's kind of been around for the brand for a while now. I'm curious what the timeline or the runway is like for that collaboration.
Yeah, Rebel's been great, and we really appreciate the opportunity to work with her. She first came into our orbit as a member. And so we became aware that she was actually a member of Noom and using the program presumably ahead of her wedding. And so when we found that out, we just naturally thought about, well, what more can we do? Because this is a very authentic use of the Noom product. She is a big believer in lifestyle, also actually in longevity and healthy aging. She's kind of outspoken in these areas in a lot of ways. And so we thought like this was a great match, both for who Noom is today at that point, which was, healthy weight and more on the weight loss side, but also for what Noom is becoming, which is really adding this healthy aging vertical as well. And so we thought that was a good platform. I was just with her recently shooting another round of commercials. We're super excited to get on air probably later this summer. So that partnership continues. I don't think we've said how long, but it is multi-year. We've been extremely happy, and we are looking for other ways of deepening that relationship.
Well, we'll be excited to see those assets when they're out and when they're available.
Yeah, they came out really well.
Really well.
And we, as you might expect, it's the focus is on not just Noom as a source of GLP-1 medications, but on Noom as combination of GLP-1 with the lifestyle change. That's really the focus on these.
If I could ask then, that sort of leads well into my next question, which is about the free GLP-1 companion app that Noom is preparing to release, at the time we're recording this episode. From a healthcare marketing perspective or messaging, branding, what kind of message are you trying to send to clinicians, patients, potential partners about providing a platform like that for free?
So we want Noom to be the de facto standard that a physician will have top of mind when prescribing a GLP-1. What we've found is that many clinicians do mention Noom, and certainly we benefit from that. But we, a lot of clinicians in our own research, it turns up that if they know they're recommending a service that essentially requires a payment, they make an assumption that the vast majority of their patients aren't going to do it anyway, so they don't bother with the recommendation. And so we really were trying to solve for that we felt like we built a very strong GLP-1 companion product. We had launched last summer a free behavior change program of Noom, the behavior change program, and that's free in the app. What this does is brings in the certain GLP-1 aspects, like the medication tracker and other aspects, into that free program. And so, but what we're trying to do with it is to make it the top of mind. And I think we'll have some provider marketing that we activate around the same time. But we didn't feel like there was any good option there. What we expect will happen over time is each of these new GLP-1 medications that will be coming out, maybe half a dozen of them over the next few years, they're probably going to all have their own kind of check the box behavior change program, that provides some information, but isn't really built as this highly retaining kind of community. And we wanted to provide something in the marketplace that could be kind of the go-to, if you're going to be on a GLP-1, because the clinician, they know when they're prescribing it, that most of the people they prescribe it to are going to stop taking it, and probably quickly, within a matter of months. And so, and they also know that they're probably going to regain the weight, and absent lifestyle change, they're going to gain it back as fat, and you could end up, worse off than when you started. And so clinicians are very cognizant of that, right? The research suggests it. And it's yet standard of care is basically, well, here's a medication. You should watch what you eat and move more, right? And why don't you try to do some strength training? That, of course, is ignored by the vast majority of people who don't. That's not a program. That's just a recommendation. That's easy to it's much harder to change behavior than that, which of course the clinician appreciates. And so that's ultimately what we're after, to try to have Noom become that brand that is even more top of mind for the clinician and solves that problem of, I'm not going to recommend this. It costs $30 a month or whatever it costs. Most people aren't going to pay that. If it's free, it's much easier to recommend.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk certainly about the results, the differences in results, and some new research that you guys have coming out. But first, if I could ask, if we zoom out a little bit on the landscape, like the GLP-1 landscape, the weight loss landscape, where do you think the industry sort of conversation is still falling short around representing like actual patient experiences when someone starts a medication?
In terms of where it's falling short, I think there still isn't nearly kind of a grappling with the low persistence, right? Like, and it's not quite clear yet if that persistence is really being driven by price or if it's essentially just human nature, right? And of course the side effect profile of the medication as well. But those are the three big kind of areas of discontinuation. And so you see industry participants, talking about losing the weight and keeping it off. But the reality is, if people are stopping to take the med and then the weight comes back, and so I think that's a thread that isn't really being confronted for the most part by the industry. I think over time, as you go out a decade, maybe you get long lasting therapies and that would obviously help with persistence. And I'm talking about more than just a month, because I think Noom is, we're looking into cardiovascular disease and kind of deepening into other cardiometabolic conditions. And the issue of persistence is not unique to obesity and overweight. It's true of statins, which are of course oral and easy to take. And also have something like 50% persistence rates, I think, at a year. So, they're often prescribed for, a disease state that sounds quite scary. I think where Noom can come in, and I think we're really investing a lot in clinical studies to kind of prove this out, including with certain university partners. But we want to show that the weight regain post med cessation is much more moderated with Noom and the GLP-1 and then cessation of that than versus just standard of care. So we feel quite confident that we're going to see that result, just given we just ran an RCT of Noom, the behavior program, where you're on Noom for 4 months in the one group, and in the other group you're just getting standard of care behavior program, which is basically like information. And then 52 weeks later, after cessation of Noom, that group who received Noom lost 4% more weight, whereas the other group gained more than 1%. So I mean, Noom as a behavior change program works, and so marrying it to the GLP-1 in different ways is really interesting. I could even, we dream of even doing more, where you could imagine that the people who are on Noom plus GLP-1 and are doing the behaviors may be the most likely to keep it off post med cessation. And then a doctor might be able to use that signal when deciding if a patient should continue or not. In general, our position is, of course, the patient should continue on the therapy if that's what the doctor believes. But we come across a number of different doctors who are thinking about deprescribing, and if they had some way of predicting success post deprescription, that would actually be a really powerful signal for them. I think if we can be that companion to the medication and that signal can flow back to your doctor, that's really the space where we think Noom could have the most value to the patient.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, some other indications beyond obesity, weight loss. Increasingly seeing more about just general cardiometabolic health, but also sleep apnea and other chronic conditions, and the studies around GLP-1's uses in those cases. And you mentioned sort of at the top of the interview how you're getting into the longevity sort of not business, but like sphere as well as a company. But how is Noom thinking about its role sort of as this GLP-1 market expands from, weight management? I think it'll always be used in weight management, right? But into other sort of whole health positions. Yeah.
So because 70% of the public has obesity or overweight, we've viewed weight as a vector into preventive health for some time. I think the way Noom is evolving is to broaden into healthy aging conditions like energy, muscle composition, sleep, kind of conditions of healthy aging, while deepening down the cardiometabolic lane into some of the things you mentioned, cardiovascular disease, maybe sleep apnea over time. We're particularly interested in cardiovascular disease because it does respond, because there's a lifestyle component, obviously, that's important to that, but there's also medication that's important to that. And some of the medications that are coming on the market next year and in the coming, I think in 2028 as well, are around blood biomarkers that are relatively novel to most people, like Lp(a). I think some people know ApoB, but Lp(a), there's going to be multiple medications on the market in the next few years about managing this biomarker that may well prove out in these trials, which is what they're running now, to show reduced cardiovascular disease incidence. And so we see kind of ample opportunity to be the behavior change program alongside medications beyond those for metabolic disease. And then, of course, as we build out some of our capabilities on sleep, you could imagine we get into sleep apnea over time. I wouldn't say that's front burner for us right now, but it's on our pipeline.
And I think that, trust and credibility are something that all brands are trying to establish all the time. But trust is especially important in this space. Especially because there are some bad actors, some people who, make claims that are unverified or worse, like just blatantly not true. How do you see Noom positioning itself or building credibility, how it's built credibility, how it continues to do so with consumers, but also, reaching and building credibility with HCPs?
So, I think one of the ways that credibility is undermined. So first of all, of course, yes, trust is critically important, especially for a brand like Noom. But one of the ways that it tends to be undermined is if you're making kind of outlandish claims in your ads, like lose 100 pounds in 6 months, or off color sort of AI generated ads, and we see it all over the place, right? From participants in this market, or doing gray market sort of pharmacies and peptides that are research grade and so forth. Those are rampant in various ad channels, and I think that weighs on the credibility of the space generally. And so we try to use well-known figures, right? Doctors. We just brought on Charles Duhigg, who wrote Power of Habit, Pulitzer Prize winner. He's part of an educational program inside of Noom, and also related to some things for Instagram that we're running in our marketing. So we try to bring in trusted voices. There's another one like that we'll be announcing relatively soon. But I would say it is an ongoing kind of fact on the ground in this market that we're generally wearing, we're not willing to say what the other guy will say. And as a result, that does constrain you in certain ways. But in the long run, we think it's absolutely critical to growing the business and the brand that we're actually trying to build. But in the short run, of course, making outlandish claims probably works, and that's why folks are doing it.
Yeah, you got to find a way to stay above the fray for sure. All right, Jeff. Well, if I could ask you one more question, sort of just if you were advising pharma marketers working on, a GLP-1 campaign, GLP-1 or sort of just general like weight loss, as the category expands, like. What would you tell them they need to understand about just generally supporting patients beyond the drug itself, the medicine itself?
Yeah, I would say two things. I would say, one, we've picked up a very clear signal that at the moment someone is considering the GLP-1 is the moment where they think they're going to begin a health journey, even non-Noom GLP-1 starts. They think this is my big moment of change. This is the reset button for me. I'm going to start doing all the things. And that is actually a really interesting kind of human nature aspect because, obviously the pharma company would like to convert that member into a GLP-1 or a potential patient into a GLP-1 program. Being able to offer a strong behavior change lifestyle program alongside of it, we think actually helps you kind of move over from kind of contemplation of into action for your health. And sometimes we think in this trans-theoretical model of health, but that contemplation to action phase is really important. So that's one thing. I think it would help sell the GLP-1. Two, we have seen, and we need more on this because what we've seen is you could claim is biased by the fact that they're Noom users, but the people who are on Noom and are top quartile users of the behavior program, so they're doing the activities, hitting their step goals, logging their meals, they persist on the medication twice as long as those who are just taking the med, and so we're sussing that out more to do it in a way that we can have more confidence that the program itself is driving it rather than the selection into the program. But I would say those two things. I think one, you'll stay on the med longer, and two, you'll be more likely to consider it. And then I think there's a third aspect, which is like the data, right? Noom, because we have you coming back, your weight, your and so forth. We're looking at kind of consented data pathways for partners where some of that information can flow back in an anonymized way. And so being able to get this very rich data could well help inform future versions of the product or how to best position it.
Absolutely. Well, thanks. This has been a really awesome conversation. I feel like it'll be a really good value to our audience, and appreciate you taking the time, and we'll be excited to continue following developments with Noom.
Thank you. Happy to do it.
Michael Jordan had his flu game, and this is going to be my unstable Wi-Fi connection game. I appreciate Lola and Bella for coming on the podcast, and you won't see me in any of the social media clips that come out of this because I'm currently in the corner of my aunt and uncle's house trying to bum off Wi-Fi from another house to be able to talk to you about some Supreme Court rulings, which is the most important part. So disregard the fact that you can't see me. What you're going to hear is actually really important. And Bella, for the sake of our listeners, why don't you kind of set the stage for us? There were two big Supreme Court rulings that came through in the past month that have a direct impact on the healthcare industry. One, I think, a little bit more than the other, but why don't you lay the scene for us a little bit?
Yeah, of course. And even today, getting pinged over and over again about Supreme Court decisions coming down. So lots happening. A few of the decisions have touched on pharma, like Jack mentioned, one a little more than the other, which is the skinny label case, about how, generic drug manufacturers can market their drugs without infringing on existing patents. And then the second is related to Bayer and the pesticide Roundup, as folks know it, and it's the risk that it carries for cancer. And so it's been an ongoing legal battle as to like what onus does Bayer have, or rather, its subsidiary company that makes this product, in warning people about the cancer risk.
And just to further set the stage, in the skinny labels case, that worked out in favor unanimously of Hikma Pharmaceuticals in their battle against Amarin Pharma. And then Bayer came out in a 7-2 decision in their favor of the Roundup case. Why don't we hone in on the skinny labels case first, Bella, at a super high level for those who don't live in Pacer land like you do, going through legal documents and such. What was the upshot of the skinny labels case?
Yeah, so the drug at the center of the dispute is called Vascepa. It's used for cardiovascular issues, and the brand name maker has a patent on it for one. They have the way patents work is that they can expire for a certain indication but continue on for other indications. And so this generic maker came in and said, we are manufacturing this generic version of Vascepa. They called it, quote, generic Vascepa or generic equivalent of Vascepa. And the brand name said, hey, actually, you're not, specifying clearly enough that you're able to manufacture this medicine and market this medicine for one indication only. And that is the indication in which the patent had expired. And so they were basically trying to prove that the generic manufacturer was influencing prescribers by being like a little bit fast and loose and just calling it a generic as opposed to a generic for this one specific indication for cardio and related to cardiovascular disease. And the court basically rejected that. It said, my sort of interpretation was like, you have to give doctors a little more credit. Like when you're saying, this is a generic drug, and it's can treat a whole slew of things, but like marketing materials, you're not going to say like generic Vascepa that does like XYZ extremely niche, like subject area expertise, like treating of a disease. Like calling it a generic is not an overreach, in essence, is what the Supreme Court decided. So it was really, the upshot is it was a win for generics manufacturers, and it will protect generics manufacturers going forward in terms of what marketing materials they have. And, the reverse, the argument from drug makers that make these brand name drugs and have these patents on them is that this type of ruling will stunt innovation and investment in, trials and continued developments of drugs without just like a really, really firm line between what is, on and off use for patents.
Which again goes back to these kind of years-long debates between the drug makers that come out with these branded medications and obviously the generics that go in there and try and have something that's more widely available to users. I want to bring Lola into the conversation here just in terms of what stuck out to her in terms of poring over the case elements and obviously the ruling. One thing that stuck out to me is I was going through a website, I believe it was Ropes and Gray, which is a law firm, and they said that there was a footnote in the decision, which again was unanimous, which good luck in the Supreme Court to agree on anything unanimously, but this one did rule in Hikma's favor. And they expressly criticized the Federal Circuit Court when this was working its way up for the recent trend of focusing on how statements could be read by medical providers rather than whether the defendant actively encouraged infringement, which I think, Bella, gets back to what you were talking about, where it's like, not that they were trying to skimp out on these things, but it was more of just like whether there was active encouragement of infringing on the patent and the indication there. But Lola, I'm curious for you, when you were pouring through this, what stuck out to you from the case?
I almost was thinking about it from like a consumer perspective. Like now that these healthcare professionals can offer these generic brands at a lower cost, we're seeing so much data lately about how people are losing their health insurance or they can't afford it anymore. So I think this is just one step to help make drugs affordable for consumers that really do need the medication.
No, it makes a lot of sense there. Bella, I'm curious too, like what you make of, it's obviously not it's not something that like this goes away. There's going to be so much more infighting too. Like you said, this is a years long dialogue, at times very fraught, between generic drug makers and those who are on the branded side. But what do you make of maybe where this proceeds from here?
You know, it's really interesting. Some of the nitty gritty of the case talked about like audiences. I think this is obviously highly relevant to our audience of medical marketers and advertisers, because they're thinking about how to reach specific audiences, HCPs versus DTC. And, you know, while those things are converging, like there are sort of, there's some separation and differences in strategy. And so I think if I could put it maybe simply, it'll allow creative teams, agencies, brands to take a little bit of a breath when they're developing marketing materials. Of course, they still have to be very, very careful. If a generics manufacturer is found to have encouraged infringement, patent infringement, it would be financially devastating to them, especially because they're often operating in smaller budgets with lower profit margins than the big name, brand name drug manufacturers. So, I think folks can take a little bit of a breath, but just know that, it's not a fast, or it's not like a blanket, like you're good, you really can do no wrong. It's more of a, this is okay for the generics, the way that they've done it now, and just, proceed with caution.
Yeah, and there's no, like you said there's no blanket, even though you can look and say, oh, it's unanimous, like this doesn't give them blanket coverage. And obviously these branded manufacturers, these ones that are in the top 20 that are trying to go out there and can make that claim about innovation, like there's still going to be arguments about that going forward. But obviously an interesting wrinkle from the communication side, especially as it relates to HCPs, which so many of the folks in our audience do focus on, which is trying to get those prescribers and getting them on board. And this gives them a little bit more clarity, not total sunshine, but a little bit more light on that case. So switching gears a little bit, the other big case that came through right at the end of the month was Bayer and its Roundup case. And Bayer years ago bought Monsanto, which makes Roundup weed killer. And I'm sure Bella, you're going to be able to walk us through that and kind of give a little bit more clarity to those in our audience who are like, why are you talking about weed killer? But there was a cancer implication there, which obviously is a big focus for our industry. So why don't you talk a little bit about that case, and then we can dive into how it was actually settled.
Yeah. So the court decided just the other day in a 7-2 decision that federal pesticide law blocks sort of what was a state level claim that would require Monsanto to add a cancer warning label when the EPA approved label doesn't contain one. And so this is a matter of preemption. Who gets to decide what warnings are placed on what products? It's a really high profile and far reaching case because, separate from this case that the Supreme Court heard, Bayer's facing Roundup claims from approximately 65,000 plaintiffs, and there's billions of dollars in settlement money on the line. All of those things are still going to have to work themselves through the court. But this ruling sort of is so important because the plaintiff, this question of what onus is there to label things with warnings and who gets to decide? Can states sort of legislate around what goes on these products, or is it preempted by federal law? The Supreme Court pretty clearly said it's preempted. And so that removes a big sort of legal argument for those tens of thousands of folks seeking damages from Bayer.
And one of the things that I think is fascinating, and you and I were talking about this when the ruling came out, is that the Trump coalition, which are, kind of dyed-in-the-wool Republicans and conservatives, big business types, going up against the MAHA reaction to it. I'd love for you to walk our audience through that, because on the one side you have, Bayer CEO saying this gives us regulatory clarity. It's going to be able to help farmers across the country. Like, this is all great. And then you have the whiplash from the MAHA side calling this, quote, a major victory for big poison, which is very pointed language.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously extremely emotionally charged for a chemical that's used in so many households across the country to be carcinogenic and maybe severely carcinogenic. That's up for the EPA to decide, as the court has said. But, a lot of people have skin in the game here. And the person who brought this case who went all the way to the top, saw the ruling overturned and that Bayer wasn't ultimately responsible. But yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. Like you said, Jack, people were saying it was a win for Big Poison. People were saying, this is just not a good sign for what's to come, because the people need some sort of accountability or way to hold these big chemical manufacturers, in this case owned by a drug maker, to account for substances that are toxic. And if not this way, then how?
And what I think is interesting too, before I bring Lola in here, is that you include this in your story. You said it does not create blanket immunity for every product. With an FDA-approved label, pharmaceuticals are governed by different statutory provisions and labeling procedures. And so that's one of the things too, where it's like people look at Bayer and there's so many different elements to that company. Obviously, we were focusing more on the consumer health and pharmaceutical side, and this is more on the agricultural side. But it's interesting where it's like, okay, so this is a win for them as a company as a whole, but on the pharmaceutical side, it doesn't really have that same pull to it, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's like, what does this do for public opinion? People who don't understand maybe the nitty gritty and how these labels are, decided, changed, regulated, who has a say, who doesn't have a say, how does the science keep pace with what we understand about carcinogenics and other toxins? So definitely something to keep an eye on. And I think it'll be an important precedent for cases like this moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, whether we see that ongoing fracture between the big business side of the Trump coalition as opposed to the more Maha RFK Jr. side. But Lola, I'm curious your thoughts too in terms of going through this. This happened, I think, literally just as you started your second part of your internship with us. So curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting, again, like you said, to be talking about like a weed killer in the pharma space. But like there's been so many conversations since I started last summer about like cancer and like what's causing cancer, how to treat cancer, that I think a lot of chemicals, for me at least, can be assumed that they could cause cancer depending like how often you use them, if like you're inhaling them, things like that. So I thought it was very interesting to see this fallout, and it was interesting to read about how strict labeling is and how like states can't even regulate additional labeling that the FDA doesn't approve.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where you get into kind of this Byzantine aspect of case law and how we go about regulations and everything. I think that's a good observation. Though I wanted you to kind of wrap us up here, with the go forward on this. You talked about the fact that obviously it gives Bayer a little bit more breathing room, but they're not out of the woods by any stretch. I think you had it here at the end of your story that they're facing more than 100,000 claims. They had agreed to a separate $2.5 billion settlement in February, but even that's up in the air in Missouri. Like, where does Bayer go from here?
Well, Bayer is still going to be on the hook most likely for a lot of, payouts for these folks. It's possible that, not all of them come to fruition. It'll be interesting. I think, was it a couple months ago that President Trump came out with like a very strong support for Roundup and the chemical, like the basis of Roundup. And so it'll be interesting to see if that sort of federal government leaders, like the president or otherwise, end up, voicing any sort of support in this case or similar cases that I'm sure will emerge at some point. But, it's kind of a classic tale of a bunch of plaintiffs, a bunch of people who are aggrieved by, are alleging that they've been aggrieved by this chemical and seeking action. And so we'll see that, continue to play out in courts across the country.
Yeah, and obviously it wouldn't be a Supreme Court case if there wasn't, people that are happy to see a ruling come down a certain way, people that are frustrated, and at the end of the day, it's just kind of a mixed bag. But I appreciate you going through all of that for our audience in terms of both the skinny label case and the Bayer case. I think it's important for them to be able to dive into stuff that maybe isn't so on the nose as other healthcare cases have been in the past, say like with the Affordable Care Act or anything, but still understand that things are happening at the high court that impact them, maybe not on a day-to-day level, but on an overall level. So I appreciate you both offering some analysis there and our listeners for being patient with me, given the state of my recording. But that's going to do it for this week's episode of the podcast. please be sure to listen to next week's episode. It'll be a good one. We're joined by Andrea Lillis, who is the SVP and Executive Creative Director of Click Health North America. She's going to hear talk about the agency's victories at Cannes, as well as scooping up their fellow A100 honoree Oxford Pharmagenesis. So that should be a very interesting conversation. Looking forward to bringing it to you then. On behalf of everyone at MM+M, please enjoy a safe and happy celebration of America's 250th anniversary over the weekend, and we will see you next week. Take care.
The MM+M podcast is produced by our editorial staff, Bella Jakowski, Lesha Bushek, Steve Madden, Jameson Fleming, and Jack O'Brien, with production and editing by Bill Fitzpatrick and Gordon Thaler. Listen to all episodes at mmm-online.com or wherever you get your podcasts.